In this discussion, our main concern is to understand the impact of the INA movement and the popular mass upsurges which accompanied the INA movement on the eve of independence. Usually, the decade of the 1940s is looked upon as a time when the Congress had discarded their strategy to undertake popular movements, mass movements, and concentrate on constitutional negotiations with the British in order to achieve independence. The 1942 movement, as you know, was the last major mass movement that the Congress had organized. After that, the Congress increasingly moved in the direction of a certain kind of constitutional or negotiated settlement. The implications of this strategy were seen in the way the Congress eventually accepted the vivisection of the country in 1947 against the backdrop of the growing popularity of the Pakistan demand among sections of the Muslim population. So while Muslim League was negotiating with the British for Pakistan, the Congress was negotiating with the British for a united India to start with, but then they arrived at a compromise which eventually divided the country. So that is one part of the story, a story which is wrapped with or which is tied with the history of decolonization during the 1940s, connected with the emergence of the Labour Party ministry in Britain and the willingness on the part of the newly elected British government to withdraw gradually from the colonies. What is missing in this kind of a story is the tremendous pressure that the INA and subsequently the movement that accompanied the INA trial in 1945-46 put on the British government. The INA had convinced them that large sections of the Indian army had become disloyal. So the disloyalty of this large force was one of the reasons why the British ultimately were persuaded to grant independence. On the other hand, the kind of popular upsurge that was taking place in India during 1945-46 in the urban areas, in which students and the working class, the labor unions were involved, and also rural movements in which the communists were leading peasants, Bengal in the Tebaga movement, in the Telengana uprising, and certain other parts of the country as well. So together, these were actually putting a good deal of pressure on the British imperial state, for which reason there was a greater willingness on the part of the British to leave India. And the Congress too, to some extent frightened by the prospect of the communists becoming very popular with the ordinary people, were also keen to arrive at a kind of a negotiated settlement. There is an argument among scholars who actually rely on certain newly discovered documents that even the Congress leadership had become so apprehensive of the kind of pressure or the kind of popularity that the communists were achieving in certain areas, that there was a greater willingness on the part to arrive quickly at a settlement, despite the risk of the partition of the country. So the story that we are going to handle today has a fairly significant implication because it makes an impact on the Indian struggle for independence on the eve of the momentous transfer of power in August 1947. It is associated with the popular upsurge, which the Congress never endorsed anymore because of their anxiety to arrive at a settlement. If we try to locate the origin of the kind of upsurge that we are talking about, it starts with the INA itself, because the INA, the National Army, that was organized by Subhas Bose out of a certain kind of ramshackle combination that the great revolutionary Raspberry Bose had already organized in Southeast Asia, can be seen as the representation of the other tradition in the national movement, the revolutionary tradition, which goes back to the early part of the 20th century and through ups and downs which survived as late as 1930s. You are all familiar with the story of how the revolutionary movement continued in the 1930s, even if some of these revolutionaries were becoming aligned with the Congress. So Bose's INA can be seen as the expression of this revolutionary urge among the Indian people in their struggle against imperialism. And INA was a fitting climax of these trends or these tendencies in the struggle for independence, fulfillment of the kind of dream that people like Jatin Mukherjee had years ago regarding the organization of armed forces in India in an act of rebellion against the British state. What exactly Jatin Mukherjee had planned and ultimately didn't succeed was achieved by Bose in Southeast Asia when he succeeded in mobilizing his national army out of a large group of Indian prisoners of war who had been taken prisoner by the Japanese. So this is one important dimension of the freedom struggle which requires to be grasped while we try to make an assessment of the Indian National Army and its impact. Bose's attempt to organize the Indian National Army in Southeast Asia also should be seen as a consequence of the manner in which he became marginalized in the Congress. Because you have this very romantic story of how he sneaked out of Calcutta from his imprisonment and taking the route via Kabul, he went to Moscow, and from Moscow he went to Germany to create the nucleus of an army by using the prisoners of war in Germany. Before that, we are all familiar with this history of how, expelled from the presidency, he was trying constantly to persuade the Congress to undertake an agitation at a moment when the British were finding themselves very weak in the context of the war. He was very anxious to take advantage of the war situation to strike the final blow on British power in India, something which the Congress would do, but would do later in 1942. But Bose wanted to carry out this a kind of a more assertive strategy. In 1940-41, he was meeting the Congress leaders. He was trying to persuade Gandhi to come around to his view about the need to organize an agitation against the British. He organized an anti-compromise conference concurrently with the Congress session at Ramgarh. Then he followed it up with a mass movement in Calcutta against the Holwell Monument to celebrate the Siraj-ud-Dowlah Day in order to free the blemish that had been heaped upon him by the British historians concerning his responsibility in the so-called Black Hole tragedy. In connection with the agitation that had happened on the Siraj-ud-Dowlah Day, he was sent into prison initially, and then he was under house arrest, from which he sneaked out in order to ultimately to connect with the German and the Axis powers.
Excuse me, sir, how does one explain Bose's decision to connect with the Axis powers?
That has been a very important question which had bothered historians. Some people would go as far up to as arguing that Bose had a kind of a secret admiration for the fascist experiment. So it is suggested at times, I think erroneously, that there was an ideological admiration for the fascist experiment, mainly because of the kind of nationalist fervor that fascism has been able to create. Bose's strategy was very simple, that at a time when the British and the Allied forces were at war with the Axis powers, and in the war in Europe, the Allied forces were retreating. France had been occupied. It was an opportune moment for the Indians to strike at the British. So one might actually consider the possibility, as Bose had reasoned, of allying with these Axis powers purely as a kind of a military strategy to unsettle the British power in India. It didn't reflect by any way his ideological convictions, because we have seen that in the course of the 1930s, he had time and again complained about the fact that Hitler had created a one-party regime which he never endorsed. He was in favor of pluralism, he was in favor of federalism, He was in favor of the multi-party system, which he thought was most suitable for India. So it has nothing to do with any ideological fascination for fascism. On the contrary, it was a sort of a military strategy that he wished to follow in order to achieve the target, the freedom. And he thought that since the British were in a very weak position in the war in Europe, since the Axis powers were gradually advancing, and he felt that in the backdrop of this kind of a military success achieved by the Axis powers, the failure of the Allied powers was imminent. He wanted to take advantage of this opportunity in order to achieve independence. He perhaps miscalculated as far as Germany was concerned. And also he realized later that the Japanese, who were more cooperative than the Germans, were also not willing to accord to Indians an equal place. So he had often complained about this. So when he was in Germany, he pleaded with the German High Command. Also, there was a meeting with Hitler in which he actually came up with this demand for recognition of a provisional government of Free India, which was to function from Berlin, a radio station called the Azad Hindustan Radio, mobilization of the prisoners of war as an Indian National Army. But except for the permission to conduct a kind of a propaganda war through the Azad Hindustan Radio, Bose had not been able to achieve anything very tangible. The National Army idea was never received endorsement from the German High Command. They only agreed to create an Indian Legion. But that Indian Legion, the number of prisoners that was available for the mobilization of the Indian Legion was much smaller than the number of prisoners of war stationed in Germany. So before long he realized that this secret journey to Berlin via Soviet Union and Kabul, for which Bose ultimately would become the romantic hero, didn't succeed. So Bose undertook another journey in a submarine to Southeast Asia. He arrived in Tokyo in 1943, July, and from there he moved to Singapore, where the Indian Independence League and the nucleus of the future Indian National Army had already been created, with Rasbihari Bose, another revolutionary, who had been involved in the bomb blast at Delhi during that famous Darbar of 1911. He was for some time living in Tokyo, and he organized the Indian Independence League there in Southeast Asia, and the Indian prisoners of war who had been taken prisoner by the Japanese readily joined this Indian army, the National Army, that Bose, Rasbihari Bose in this case, with the support of a man who was an officer of the British Indian Army, Brigadier Mohan Singh. They created the nucleus of a force, but soon, because of the differences with the Japanese, this force became defunct. Mohan Singh was taken prisoner, along with a few other officials of this force that Rasbihari Bose had been able to mobilize. Although the Indian Independence League had taken the resolution inviting Bose to Southeast Asia in order to take over the mantle of the leadership of both the Indian Independence League and the armed force that they had mobilized, Bose arrived later. Yes?
Sir, how does Bose's arrival in Southeast Asia change the complexion of the situation?
That is a very important question. In the first place, the kind of mobilization that Rasbihari Bose along with Mohan Singh had been able to achieve was to some extent vitiated by this constant bitterness with the Japanese, constant irritation that the Japanese caused to them by posing as a superior nation, as a superior force. The Japanese wanted them to collaborate, but collaborate as a subordinate partner, which Mohan Singh and others didn't like. So once Bose was in Southeast Asia, he was able to reorganize this armed force, and not merely by giving it the name of the Indian National Army for which it became famous. He organized the brigades. In order to create an army, you have to create an organizational structure. Bose created 4 brigades: Gandhi Brigade, Azad Brigade, Nehru Brigade, and the 4th one in his own name, the Subhas Brigade. He recruited some officers of the British Indian Army. 3 of them ultimately became very famous during the INA trial on the eve of independence: Shahnawaz Khan, J.S. Dhillon, and Saigal. They were given the command of the armed forces. There was meticulous planning about how to strike the military assault on in British India. There was meticulous planning through radio broadcasts, meticulous planning of how to use the radio broadcast in order to persuade people to rise in rebellion against the British once the Indian National Army would be arriving in India. So all this actually changed the complexion of the situation. In addition to this, Bose's arrival in Southeast Asia with an unblemished record of assertive leadership aroused residents, Indian residents in Southeast Asia. There were diasporic communities there who were energized by the presence of this great leader, who had been addressing meetings, who had been making speeches, and the kind of inspiration that Bose had been able to impart into their minds was also responsible to a large extent for their volunteering their services for the Indian National Army. Think of the women brigade that he ultimately was able to organize under the command of Lakshmi Swaminathan, the Jhansi Brigade or the Jhansi Regiment. Not that there were a large number of women participants, but the fact that more than 1,000 women volunteered and decided to join the Indian National Army by participating in the organization of the Women's Brigade only shows very clearly the kind of enthusiasm that Bose's presence in Southeast Asia had been able to generate. If we consider all this, if we consider popular response, if we consider the enthusiasm of the diasporic communities, if we consider the creation of a women's brigade, all this is suggestive of the fact that the presence of Bose in Southeast Asia, his decision to take over the mantle of the leadership of the Indian Independence League, his planning regarding the Indian National Army, his planning to set foot in Indian soil through the Burma, all these actually made a very different situation once he was there. So he took over the administration of the Andamans. As we were all familiar with the story of how these 2 islands were renamed as Shahid and Swaraj. It passed into Japanese occupation for some time. Then the Japanese transferred it to the Provisional Government of Free India, which was proclaimed from Singapore by Bose and which was recognized by the Axis powers. So from the Andaman Islands, Bose initially operated. Then he moved to Rangoon, and from Rangoon, his army started moving into Imphal. Imphal fell, but once he decided to take his plunge on Kohima, tide began to turn against him. The Japanese, in the meanwhile, had begun to suffer defeat. In the other theaters of war, the Air Force was withdrawn. The air cover that the Indian National Army initially enjoyed during the early years of its advance into the Indian soil was removed by the Japanese in order to defend their own country. In the absence of this air cover and with heavy rains, the situation became precarious for the Indian Army during July 1945. And we are all familiar with the remainder of the story, that the Indian National Army also capitulated along with the Japanese. In August 1945, Bose was taking the flight to Tokyo from Bangkok. There was an air crash and he died. Now there is a controversy, of course, surrounding his death. Some people say that he was alive. Some people say that he was sent into prison. Some people said that he would come back. So he was the lost hero of the nation. Now, this mythical projection of the lost hero was compounded by the uncertain nature of his death. But this is the story of the INA, that how it actually represented the tradition of organizing a massive revolutionary upsurge with the help of armed forces. The point that I was trying to emphasize in the early part of the discussion concerns the kind of impact that INA was able to make on Indian politics despite its military failure.
Sir, how did the INA exert such a great political impact on India during 1945-46?
That has to do with the INA trial from November 1945. For the first time, in fact, Nehru, in order to defend the INA prisoners of war, wore this lawyer's coat. The INA detainees were defended in the military court by Bhulabhai Desai, by Tej Bahadur Sapru. Some of these men were very distinguished lawyers and at the same time were important political personalities in India. You had Nehru on the other hand. Asaf Ali, for example, also was one of those who defended the INA detainees in this trial. So the INA trial actually aroused a good deal of popular interest. In fact, a popular movement. The INA Day was celebrated parts of the country, particularly in some of the major cities, including Calcutta. And during the INA Day, there was processions and popular students' involvement was very remarkable in this. And along with the students, you also come across the intensive participation of the working classes in the INA Day movement. And while in the trial, some of these officers like Dhillon and Shagal and Shahnawaz were released, the court pronounced a judgment against a man called Abdul Rashid. So the demand was raised for Rashid's release. The Rashid Ali Day was celebrated, in which there was a recurrence of this popular agitation. The Rashid Ali Day was celebrated by a good deal of popular upsurge in the city of Calcutta, but in other cities as well, this movement made an impact, in which the communists were playing a very significant role. Many of the students who had been attracted to communist ideology were playing a very significant role. So you can see the kind of impact that INA had been able to make on the popular mind, especially when we try to evaluate the sort of impact that these popular movements were actually making on Indian politics.
So, what was the attitude of the Congress toward these popular upsurges?
This will be demonstrated by the kind of position that the Congress takes regarding another movement, which came closely following the INA trial movement or the Rashid Ali movement. There was a difference of a week. The Rashid Ali movement rocked Calcutta on the 12th of February. On the 18th February, in several naval installations of the country, the sailors of the Royal Indian Navy rebelled. It started in Bombay in the battleship called Talwar, in which the sailors rebelled, raised the flags of the Congress, Muslim League, and they were demanding the creation of the Indian National Navy. And the impact of the Bombay sailors movement, the RIN mutiny as it is known, the Royal Indian Navy mutiny, made its impact on several other naval installations, including Karachi, Visakhapatnam, Cochin, and several other places. So when the Congress leaders, while they were willing to defend the INA detainees in the public trial, they were not very keen to bail out the sailors. In fact, Gandhi said that this was a bad precedent. Patel pleaded with the sailors in Bombay to surrender. So from this you can actually get a sense of how the Congress leadership were becoming unnerved by these kinds of popular movements. And these were not urban movements alone. I was talking about the rural mobilization, the rural movements, peasant movements taking place in Bengal on the issue of Tebaga, that is the claim that the peasants make on the 2/3 share of what they were producing. You have the Telengana movement starting around the same time and continued till the early 1950s. You have a similar peasant movements in Bombay Presidency in certain areas. Tribal peasants decided to rebel against local oppression, demanding their access to forest. You have the similar movements in Travancore. So you have in 1946, on the eve of independence, several popular movements. Some of these movements were linked with INA trial, with the kind of upsurge that the INA trial had created. Some of these were peasant movements in the rural areas in which the communists were achieving a good deal of prominence. It was a marginal force at that time, but the manner in which it was emerging as a popular force, at least in certain pockets, was a source of consternation for the Congress leadership. So there is some sense in the argument that the great emphasis that the Congress leadership was placing on the negotiated settlement perhaps had something to do with, apart from their own inertia, apart from the fact that some of them were unwilling to trade on the agitational path once again, there was a feeling of threat as well. It is also perhaps not correct to describe the situation, as some left-wing historians had often done, as a kind of an almost revolution. It was not so revolutionary, but at the same time, popular upsurge was quite threatening for the Congress leadership. But at the same time, it was also threatening for the British, particularly the disloyalty that the British saw among the soldiers and the sailors. And this was also one reason why the British on their part were so anxious to arrive quickly at a negotiated settlement.